Dr. Clark, what was that quote from Amartya Sen? I wasn't looking at the board, but the two words.
Informed agitation.
Exactly. Now, who does that describe, other than Dr. Bill Moomaw, who's our next speaker? Informed agitation is, I think, what Sen was talking about was the ability to move knowledge, and including emerging and new knowledge, into action. And I think that a good chunk of Dr. Bill Moomaw's career has been spent on doing just that. He was leading author on at least 5 IPCC reports between 1995 and 2010. Maybe there are more, but I know of those 5, which means he's a Nobel Prize laureate, along with the rest of the IPCC. So that's climate change. As a AAAS Congressional Science Fellow, he was instrumental in establishing the legislation that controlled CFCs in spray cans, protecting the ozone layer, number 2. He was also a major contributor to research on nitrogen pollution, both for the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment and also for the EPA Science Advisory Board. So he's been at the forefront of a number of these efforts to actually move science into policy in this country and internationally, and I think he's been very effective, and he'll be talking to us this afternoon about sustainable development diplomacy. Dr. Moomaw.
Well, Reinmar has blown my cover, obviously, here with that introduction. I'm actually a chemist by training, and I spent the first half of my career as an honest chemist practicing the dark arts of chemistry. Bill Clark may not remember this, but the transition came, actually, shortly after meeting him. I was on sabbatical doing basic science at the Technische Hochschule in Garching, Germany, near Munich, and was visiting Vienna. I had heard of Bill Clark, and I said, well, we're going to be there. Could I come by? And he said, yeah, and you could do a seminar. And so I got to give a seminar standing there while they're in the summer palace of the Habsburgs with this huge portrait of Maria Theresa looking down on me the whole time. And there I met a fellow from Lithuania who induced me to come to a conference in Lithuania, which was a conference in 1987, believe this or not, on sustainable development. It was the first plan of a Soviet republic that was written by the republic and not by Gosplan in Moscow. It was an extraordinary experience, really transformed my whole approach to things. Went back and decided I needed to make a change, and did. So moved into a different world. I'd done some of the work with Congress and so on before that, and was sort of looking for an excuse to try to figure out how to make it fit into more practice. As Bill has said, sustainability science is really inquiry into the relationships among people, their built environment, and the natural world. And it's obviously, as you got the sense at the end, very intellectually exciting, very challenging. It's not interdisciplinary, it's transdisciplinary. You know, you go to a problem and then you use whatever tools every discipline has that you need to solve that problem. Such a different way from the way universities are structured, but it's the only way that the world out there organizes itself. Not the way we have done it for 150 years on a German model of universities, but rather as we go to the problem and just take the tools we need and work with the people who can use those tools better than we can. And so as Bill pointed out, humans affect their environment, affect the natural world, and the natural world affects and determines what our societies are like and how we function, and our well-being. I've always used this term too, rather than GDP numbers and things like that. Well-being is what we're really after, and that's a complicated thing to identify, but you know it when you see it. You can see when people are better off. People know when they're better off. And so the goal is to try to understand all these interactions sufficiently that we can continue to use ecosystem services now and in the future to improve well-being. As Bill said, if we are decreasing our stocks, our basic stocks, we are not improving things for the future. So The whole issue, as you know, was in '87, came out with Our Common Future, and finally this year that got became developed into the Sustainable Development Goals, 17 of them. And it's interesting, about half of them are in the socio-economic sphere and half of them are really in the environmental sphere. As Bill said, some of them are about ending poverty, which is a form of unwell-being, if you like. And they do it through, 3 of them are about ensuring equitable and quality education, gender equality, reducing economic inequality. So 3 of them are about what Bill was saying about the social side. I'll come back to some of that in a moment. I want to actually take 4 of these because they're so basic, but show how they're interconnected, and give you some examples of how sustainability, what I would call a good sustainability science, has led us to get on the right path, get on the better direction to a more sustainable future, and how a misuse of science, I would call it unsustainability science, or unsustainable, the science of unsustainability, has been used with the best of intentions to head us off in the very wrong direction. So let me begin, and then at the end I will talk about sustainable development diplomacy, which I define as the process by which we take what we know from sustainability science and convert it into the social, economic, and political aspects of addressing the problems. So that's kind of the trajectory I'll follow here. So I'll start with climate change. That's one of the sustainable development goals. That's a good one to have, I think. That's a very reasonable thing to have in that list. So combat climate change. There's also end hunger. There's provide affordable, sustainable, and modern energy. And there's protect and restore terrestrial ecosystems. And I think those are really all part of the same basic approach that we need to take to address human and improve human well-being in a sustainable manner. So let's just run through some of this. So we've figured out quite some time ago that it was the release of heat-trapping greenhouse gases that was changing the temperature of the world, and that is the first step in changing the climate system. You know, we often hear this question whenever anything happens: did climate change cause something or other? Which is actually a very foolish way to state the question, and most scientists answer it in an even more foolish way. No single event can be attributed to climate change. Now, since when did climate change, which is a result, become a cause of anything? Right? It's a changed climate that we're talking about, and what it really is we have changed the climate system so fundamentally that events that we're seeing are taking place. Some of them are pretty straightforward. Sea level rise. Right? Warm up the Earth, melt all those glaciers and ice caps. Greenland's melting at twice the rate it was in 2009. Warm water expands, sea level's rising. It's accelerating. That's not so difficult to understand. We don't need a computer model for that. We don't need IPCC prognostications on it. Cities along the whole East Coast are experiencing now 4 times as many floods as they were in the 1970s. You know, it's real, it's happening. So, but let's come back to climate change, because that's what I want to and our attempts to address it. A recent paper just appeared 10 days ago summarizes something that I've been working on with a variety of people, and that is the recognition. The good sustainability sciences says, well, okay, carbon dioxide is the big problem here with climate change. Much of that is coming from burning fossil fuels, but also some of it's coming from agriculture and deforestation and soil degradation. New paper just came out, estimated that 1 billion tons a year of carbon dioxide is going directly into the atmosphere from soils. Soils are what are going to get us here, because as the Earth warms and we begin releasing the methane and carbon dioxide from the frozen soils, the permafrost soils, that could just put the whole thing completely out of control. But soils are also a potential savior. If we could put some of the 200 to 300 billion tons of carbon dioxide that's gone into the atmosphere from soils over millennia of deforestation and poor agricultural practices, we could actually not only meet the 2-degree target, we could probably lower concentrations over this century to a level below 400 parts per million, perhaps even below 350 parts per million. We would have to also, it's not either or. Whenever I give this talk and there are people from the energy industry in the audience, they're ecstatic. Oh, we don't have to stop using fossil fuels. No, we have to stop using fossil fuels. That's necessary. But it's not going to be sufficient because whatever level we get to, we will be stuck with, the world will be stuck with that basic temperature for a millennium or more. That's the work of Susan Solomon, 2009, and followed up by other people. That is unsustainable. That is 50 generations, subject to the mistake we make in this century. That's probably not a nice thing to leave 50 generations with. So that's the antithesis of sustainability. So Ski Houghton and his colleagues have just published a paper 10 days ago, which points out that tropical deforestation releases about a billion tons of carbon as carbon dioxide every year. That the previously cut forests that are regrowing are absorbing about 3 billion tons. And that if we could halt the emissions, the 1 billion tons, and if we could allow these forests that are absorbing 3 billion tons a year to continue growing, and plant maybe 500 million hectares of reforestation, that in fact we would bring carbon dioxide levels down to between 350 and 400 parts per million if we also stop putting it in from fossil fuels, okay? So those are all the steps you got to take. Other people working in agriculture have shown that probably half the carbon in the agricultural soils of the world has gone into the atmosphere. It's actually probably more than has gone in from fossil fuels. It's an astounding amount. Suppose we could put it back in. If you go out to Iowa, you will see churches sitting up on pedestals that are about 8 feet above the surrounding cornfields. The surrounding cornfields 100 years ago were at the same level as the church. The soils have subsided because of agricultural practices. Some of it from runoff into rivers and streams, erosion, but some of it just oxidation of the carbon material in the soils into the atmosphere. Stunning. Grazing lands, 80% of the world's grazing lands are degraded according to the UN. Grazing practices did that damage. Different grazing practices can restore the carbon. So there are all kinds of ways in which we could be doing things in a sustainable way, not in a hard infrastructure way, but using natural infrastructure, which is a term I've just recently learned by working with some corporations who have finally seen that there's an opportunity for them to actually get involved in something that would be constructive rather than constantly doing things that are destructive. So rebuilding natural infrastructure is one approach. Okay, so what's happening in reality? Well-intended, but here's what's happened. Bioenergy. In the United States now, 40% plus of our corn crop goes into making ethanol for gasoline. 10% required to be in fuel, and just this week, earlier this week, the EPA raised the blending wall to 15%. So now we'll have to have 15% in there. Does that mean that 60% of our corn crop will now go into ethanol? Europeans have insisted on this, and they insist on it for diesel, because diesel is a much better way of doing things, and clean diesel is the way to go. And the way to make it go is to change the programming in your automobile engine so that when it's tested, it comes out clean. In other words, it can't be done. Clean diesel is like clean coal. It just doesn't exist. It's a fiction. So where are they getting their biodiesel from? Well, there's not enough land in Europe to grow that much of it. So they're getting it from palm oil. Where does palm oil come from? Indonesia and Malaysia, among other places, now increasingly in Honduras and elsewhere. The huge fires in Indonesia were set to clear more land to produce more biodiesel, more palm oil for biodiesel in Europe, got totally out of control. Every day for 2 months, the emissions from the fires in Indonesia exceeded the entire carbon dioxide emissions of the US economy. Staggering. Will the Europeans count that against the supposed savings? No, not a chance. Not a chance. I can tell you this, the atmosphere is accounting for it. That means the climate system is being changed and accounting for it. So we have the biofuels. Then we have biomass. You know, we shifted from wood to coal because it was a much better fuel back in the 19th century. And now we are shifting back to biofuels. The Brits are, I just spent 4 days in London, met with people at the Department of Energy and Climate Change, met with members of Parliament, a member of the House of Lords, no less, a bunch of NGOs, trade associations. What the British are doing is spending $1 billion a year for a company called Drax, which is that's a wonderful name for a company, that is being shifted. The British are going to cut out, coal will end in 2025. However, if you looked at the phasing out of coal plants, there would only be 1% of the electricity produced by coal in Britain in 2025 if they don't build any more plants. So they just put a stake through the heart of coal just to make sure it's dead. They're going to replace it with biofuels. Anybody been to Sherwood Forest lately? I think there are 4 trees maybe left. I don't know, there's not much. So where is Great Britain getting their wood from? Well, North Carolina looks like a good place, but we only take wastes and thinnings. Little NGO called the Dogwood Alliance has photos of trucks leaving a clear-cut natural forest with logs 3 feet in diameter. Oh, says the company, those are just thinnings. Why? Because they sent 3 logs from that 1,000-acre clear-cut to a mill. And this is to improve the regrowth, is to get rid of those big trees that are in the way of little trees that might grow there later. Well, the myth of carbon neutrality of biomass is really a myth. I mean, it is a myth. The argument has always been you burn a tree, a new tree grows in its place. My graduate students have shown there is not a single set of rules in any state in the United States, the United States federal government, or in Europe, or any place in the world that requires a tree be planted. Number one. Number two, how long does it take to burn a piece of wood? About 15 minutes. How long does it take to grow that tree back? About 50 to 100 years. The carbon's either in the tree or it's in the atmosphere. It's in the atmosphere the entire time, it's not in the tree once it's burned. IPCC rules say you have a choice. If you're going to use biomass energy, you must account for it in one of 2 columns. When you burn it or when you cut it. Wait a minute. Those are American emissions now because the British are not counting them. To the atmosphere, it doesn't care who counts them, but the atmosphere knows that they're there. I was absolutely stunned. And in a meeting with a lawyer, a group of us raised with the modeler in the room who agreed that, yes, it's not really carbon neutral, but in fact, she said, if we don't count it as neutral, we cannot meet our obligations under EU mandates. Okay, interesting. Amazing. Okay, so where do we go from here? Can't meet them, and they'll get a fine. They'll get a fine if they don't call it neutral. So by definition, all biomass burned under the European system is defined as 0 carbon. Defined. does not make it so in the atmosphere. The other shocking thing I learned is that the Europeans, of course, have done a lot with renewable energy. They met their Kyoto targets that way. 62% of the renewable energy in the European Union is bioenergy. Defined as zero. Just like solar, just like wind, just like nuclear, just like hydro. This is not sustainability science. The US EPA had a memo going around saying the same thing. Bill Schlesinger, many of you know, an ecologist, head of the Carey Center and so forth, and at Duke for many years, and I got 78 scientists. Imagine getting 78 scientists to agree on anything. It helped to have worked in the IPCC for a while. You knew how to bring them in. To Gina McCarthy pointing out that you could not count them as carbon neutral. It may be less than burning coal if you think it is. Actually, it's 50% more because wood burns so inefficiently. So sending teams over to chop up North Carolina, pelletize it, ship it to Britain, burn it in a power plant is not carbon neutral. And yet the State Department is pushing to export more pellets simply because it improves our trade's position. Okay, all right? So this is where it gets really messy and complicated and where I get a little upset. I mean, it just seems to me that this is such a diversion, well-intended, seemed like such a good idea, but it's so destructive. The ecosystem destruction is profound, runs absolutely counter to we must restore and protect our terrestrial ecosystems, one of the Millennium Development, or the Ecosystem Development Goals. If we could restore carbon to soils, we would improve food productivity in the world. If we could improve grasslands, it would improve the lives of all the pastoral people and the ranchers and all the people who depend upon grazing animals for food and dairy in the world. If we could restore rather than destroy forests and not count on them as an energy source, which is terribly inefficient anyway, 1% efficiency photosynthesis, power plants 25% efficient, that's a 0.25% of the solar energy coming in gets converted to electricity. I just recently bought solar panels that are 20% efficient. That's an 80-fold greater efficient use of the solar energy falling on that area, whatever that area is, 1 hectare, 1 acre, 1 rooftop. Why do we do these things? And we're subsidizing it. We're subsidizing it in this country and in Europe. So this is an example of why we have to do sustainability science. We have to move in the direction of getting the science right and translating that science into policies that actually address the problems of which they're intended. So restorative development, which is a little bit different than sustainable development. No point sustaining what's really destroyed. Let's restore it first and then sustain it, is something that we have to think about. And that's another kind of arm of this. And let me then just conclude with how we might do this. Over the past 7 years at Fletcher, we've been working on this idea of sustainable development diplomas. If we want sustainable development, we need a process for getting there. And so many issues actually turn out to be about a failure to do things sustainably. So first thing, frame it as a sustainable development issue, number one. Number two, create a mutual gains approach for getting an agreement for what you're going to do. Too many things are top down. Not everything that's bottom up will work. You'll see in a moment how to deal with that. Engage multiple state and non-state actors, all of those who have an interest in this. Assemble the relevant scientific, economic, and political information that's necessary so that you know which path to follow. Obviously, with the biomass, the scientific part was not engaged. This was just made up as a convenience. Develop a solution that is compatible in complexity with the complexity of the problem. Too often we have solutions that are either too complicated, the U.S. healthcare system, for example, the Healthcare Act, the U.S. tax code, way too complicated for what it's supposed to accomplish, or too simplistic, in which case it doesn't solve the problem. So getting that levels of complexity together is important. And then we have to select both effective leaders and figure out what is the best place in the top, between the top and the bottom to interject a particular thing. Sometimes it is at the bottom, sometimes it's at the top, but often it's somewhere in between. This is why in Paris, I think the most interesting thing that will come out will be what the regions and cities do. Mayors and governors are going to sign an agreement pretending that they are international actors. None of it is binding in the international treaty world, but if they all agree and they go home and they have to meet next year and everybody looks at it and says, well, what, did you do it? Right? There's going to be some pressure. And you look, California and New York have both pledged to be 50% renewable by 2030, right? All their electricity, 50% renewable. California has pledged to be double the efficiency of all buildings in California by 2030. That's going to be quite an undertaking, but it's certainly worth doing. So that's where the action is. And finally, we have to ensure that whatever instruments we create, whatever international agreements or national laws or even business contracts are actually addressing the problem, and that they are adaptable as conditions change, flexible enough to not crack when they are challenged, but strong enough to withstand the challenges that will eventually come. So if we can put together a sustainable development diplomacy structure, and we're seeing parts of it, it's really happening, and I've worked this out actually with people like Rachel Kite at the World Bank and other people at that level around, and ask, you know, does this really work? And they cite to be, we have 125 case studies where we looked at where any one or more of these were put into place, and they really did lead to much better outcomes than the usual way of doing business. So I hope, I know I've depressed you in one way, but hopefully I've also given you a sense of how we might address this and do a better job in another. Thank you.